They would round up the people the city squares and then literally put them on trains and send them back home to Mexico, even though it's estimated that about 60% of the people who were repatriated were actually American-born citizens.
This is composer Reynaldo Moya, and he was talking about the Mexican repatriation happened between 1929 and 1936. During the period of time, an estimated number of 2 million people were deported from the United States. Set against such a political dynamic, Tienda, Moya's chamber opera, explores the life of a Mexican musician and his immigrant story.
Originally, it was just going to be the story of this man who came to Minnesota with an orchestra from Mexico. They played some concerts in Minneapolis. He got sick and he got left behind while the orchestra kept going on their US tour. And he stayed here in Minnesota and built a life for himself, started an orchestra, and opened a grocery store. And the store became a kind of community center for the Latin American, for the Mexican American, really specifically community in St. Paul. So it's based on this very real man who would have lived through this, and there was an actual repatriation drive in St. Paul. What started to happen after the Depression, the economy was, of course, tanking. And as usually happens, the immigrants are the first ones to get blamed for everything that's going wrong. So there were these nationwide drives where they would collect Mexican-looking people, and that's really how they thought of it. If you look Mexican, you were Mexican, and send them back home. It was important to highlight that this is not a new history, that this is not a new part of the American story. This has been going on for decades and centuries. And like the saying goes, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to shed light on a forgotten chapter of American history. I related a lot to the main character, right? So in many ways, Luis became a kind of an avatar for my own story of dealing with my own immigration demons. This idea of Luis later in the opera, he feels betrayed by America. There's the final scene is because we've decided to double cast Luis, so we have young Luis and then the old Luis, right? So we see how he comes to Minnesota, how he stays and he meets his eventual wife. But then we see him as an old man. He's the owner of the store. He's the community leader, and he's trying to help the community. And inadvertently ends up providing information to an immigration officer that then helps send a bunch of people home. But at the epilogue of the opera, we see the two old Luis and young Luis coming together. Mm-hmm. And this is happening when the young Luis is becoming a citizen during his swearing-in ceremony, right? So he's reciting the oath of right. to the Constitution, and then the old Luis is kind of commenting on what he sees. He's remembering that moment, but also inserting his own commentary on that. And it's when I read that in the libretto, I almost cried. I mean, that was all Caitlin. She was so great in kind of setting that up. And I had just become an American citizen the previous year. So I had just gone through that. And then that disappointment that Luis feels with the American dream and his own American story was the disappointment I felt after Trump's election, right? Which was the first time I got to vote in any election ever was November 8th, 2016. That kind of sense of betrayal that that America had betrayed its ideals, right? And that you spend all this time here and you believe that American dream, and then to see it kind of crumble right in front of your eyes, it was a really poignant thing. Obviously, there are other parallels. My wife is American too, and Luis's wife is American. Wow. And I finished Tienda like a week before my son was born, and I dedicated it to him as well. And so, yeah, it was very poignant coming together of a lot of aspects of my life. Even though Luis, it's a different story, and Luis is Mexican, I'm Venezuelan, and all of that. But there were a lot of parallels in that I felt was important for me to tell the story. So we did it. We did it twice. We did it the first time in St. Paul, and we did it in last year. We did it at the neighborhood house, which was a kind of a community center that Luis himself had helped create.
Oh, interesting.
Was a center for the community to come together in St. Paul, in the kind of the Latin American neighborhood of St. Paul, the Mexican American neighborhood in St. Paul. So to me, it was important to bring that piece there and to
Yeah.
share with that community. And then this past year in February, right before the pandemic, this was like the last thing we did. We did it at my university. We're celebrating 150th anniversary, and we staged it in our own chapel. And the twist here was that we added a food component
A food
to
component.
to the to the show, because food ended up is a really important part of the show, because it's at the store, and people come to the store to get their ingredients to make their food, and food became a really important part of home for these people, right? They were no longer in Oaxaca, in warm Oaxaca. They're in cold, bitter Minnesota. And so to be able to go in there and get the things that you could get the ingredients and go home and make yourself a mole and remind yourself of home and of mom, as people in the show are talking about the food, and because there's a lot of items in the show that we hand out food to the audience, so people got to taste the moles, and they got to taste the different things. I came as a teenager. There was a time where I was like trying to leave that behind, and I wanted to assimilate, and like just wanted to, especially when I was in school. I think I was really trying to like sound more neutral, or to not wear my Venezuelanness in my sleeve, kind of thing. Um, and I think the older I get, like the more I'm shedding that, and the more comfortable and excited and fascinated I become by that culture and by its history and what it means to me. Becoming a father has really had an impact on how I think about Venezuela. Like, it's deepened that relationship. It's deepened that nostalgia that I feel for it. Like, the fact that um I now have two kids, and I want to be able to share my my homeland with them, and that I can't really take them there, and it's not just that's not just because of the pandemic, and but it's just because of like the situation there is not safe, and most of the people that I know and love don't even live there anymore, right? So Venezuelans, I talk about this in some of my work, and in interviews like this. Like, Venezuelans have had to basically like gotten used to the idea that their country doesn't exist anymore, as they remember it. That it's a country that we collectively need to keep remaking, and we need to keep it alive in our own imaginations, and in our own, like, from all over the world. So you have now millions of Venezuelans all over the world that are collectively keeping Venezuela alive. That's not to say that there isn't an actual real country still there, and that there are people living there and suffering and experiencing. But if you grew up there and you left, that country is not there for you to come back to.
Right.
It's changed so much. And so this idea of me trying to share this world with my children, I've had to really think a lot about how to do that, and what it means to do that. And a lot of that is through music, is through food, is through the language.